Today we're going to learn about complex conjugates problem. What are the conjugates of 7 plus 6i, negative 2 minus 4i, and negative 3 plus 5i? So before we find the conjugates of these complex numbers, let's first understand what a complex conjugate is. So a complex conjugate is basically the same thing as a complex number, but the only difference is that the sign of the imaginary term is opposite. So a complex number is in the form of a plus bi. So this is a complex number. So, the complex conjugate is the same thing as a complex number, except for the sign of the imaginary term is opposite. So, the form for a complex conjugate is a minus bi. So this is the form for a complex conjugate. So, a complex conjugate is when the sign of the imaginary term is opposite. So the opposite of plus is minus, and the opposite of minus is plus. And note that the sign of the real term, which is a, does not change. Here a is positive, and here a is also positive. So now let's find the conjugates of 7 plus 6i. So, the only difference between a complex number, which this is, and a complex conjugate is that the sign of the imaginary term is opposite. So, that means that the complex conjugate for 7 plus 6i is 7, and the opposite of plus is minus, so 7 minus 6i. And this is a complex conjugate because the sign of the real term did not change and the sign of the imaginary term became opposite. Now let's move on to the next problem. Negative 2 minus 4i. So, we have to change the sign of the imaginary term. So we get negative 2, and the opposite of here, negative, is positive. So plus 4i. And we know this is a complex conjugate because the sign of the real term does not change. So it's negative, negative, and the sign of the imaginary term becomes opposite. The opposite of minus is plus. Now let's move on to this complex number. So we have to convert it into a complex conjugate. So we know the term, or the sign of the real term does not change, so we get negative 3, and then we have plus 5i. And we know that we have the opposite sign for the imaginary term. So the opposite of plus is minus. So minus 5i. And this is a complex conjugate because the sign of the real term does not change. It's negative and negative. However, the sign of the imaginary term does change from positive to negative, and the negative is the opposite of positive. So, today we learned about complex conjugate problems. Thank you for watching this video.